Hey, my name is Justin Lawrence, and today we're going to be talking about the state of the industry for software engineers. This is going to cover the week of January 4th, and because the first week in the new year, we're going to be covering a lot of kind of general surveys for 2025, just to kind of sum it up. But a lot of the information is as of this week, so we're going to try and keep it as latest and greatest as possible to keep everything super duper relevant. A lot of this content's pulled from Hacker Relay, our platform. It gives us a lot of analytics and insights. So if any of this information looks like something you'd want to see more frequently, you can kind of look it up there. Let's dive right into it. So there's really three topics that we're going to talk about today. The first one is the models. So when we talk about that, we're talking about frontier companies, frontier models, the latest and greatest AI, because that's just so relevant in everything that we do as engineers these days. There is the market, so who's hiring, who's firing, and what does that typically look like? And then lastly is the meta, so like the actual game of being a software engineer, whether it's optimizing for quality of life or whatever it is that you are, understanding kind of what the areas you can have an advantage, especially with AI being so prevalent. How can you still stand out? That's what we'll cover in that little section. Let's dive into the model. So there are really kind of four primary players. There's way more, but there's the four big ones right now, which is OpenAI, which we'll talk a little bit about, but they're definitely one of the biggest players right now as far as like percentage of daily active users, people using it, not just software engineers, but just wider usage among the public. Anthropic, which is really doubled down on trying to provide value to software engineers, and I think is doing a really great job with that. Google, who is definitely the sort of the legacy heritage brand among these four that we're going to talk about today, but is really started to make an impression lately with their latest Gemini. And then there's XAI, which sounds kind of random, like what are they doing here? But a lot of engineers are using them, and we'll talk a little bit about some of their metrics. But they're having a huge impact, especially when we talk about actual building out brick and mortar, actually getting servers in buildings. That seems to be an area that they're really winning. Let's dive into OpenAI. So there's really obviously their latest frontier model, which is 5.2. It's been really, I think, surprised a lot of people because they said, hey, it's the greatest, latest, greatest. But it wasn't really until that I actually saw their 80% software engineer bench number that I actually felt pretty confident that it actually could stand its own among other ones like Anthropic. Really, really solid. If you think about 70% being like a senior engineer, once we start talking the 70, mid 70s, 80s, we start talking about beyond a senior engineer, and that's really crazy. And so to see them be able to do that, and what is really cheap or really widely accessible and already widely used model, that's a lot. In a Stack Overflow kind of survey for 2025, we did see up to 81% of engineers are using it as a part of their workflow. And again, you got to think early 2025, it was probably one of the better players. But if you think of what is a part of a workflow, if you're doing R&D, you're doing research, that plays in that as well. So I think some of that 80% isn't just, hey, them copying and pasting code and then pasting it out, because their integration with a lot of these platforms isn't necessarily super duper good unless you're using something like a Copilot. But if you're actually using ChatGPT.com, that's just, I think that's a bit of a stretch to think it would be that high unless you're using it for R&D and research, stuff like that. Of note, they did come out with sort of a browser in late 2025, which is sort of, if you've used any of these other ones that are out there, it's kind of like that. It's basically like Chrome with AI built into it. They do have this sort of agent mode, which is really interesting, which you can kind of click around a page for you, which is kind of interesting, and we'll see how far that goes. But right now, it's just on Mac, so the adoption's been somewhat limited due to that. But yeah, we'll see how things go there. But it is an interesting play by them. Next is Anthropic, which seems to be leading the way as far as software engineer specific models and actually solving for those types of problems that we're interested in. The highest score that I'm aware of right now, at least among the mainstream models and not within like a research setting, of 80.9 on software engineer bench, which you might say, hey, well, that's basically a wash with OpenAI. Well, in some sense, yes, but in another sense, that 0.9 is a lot when you get talking at that scale. And when you talk about touching thousands of files for thousands of hours, that 0.9% makes a big difference. And They currently have a very limited model in that it is very like it's not multimodal and is very focused on a singular problem. But to their credit, they are doing a really good job with it, and a lot of people are enjoying not just model but also Claude Code, which is their kind of tool for building out things. And I was surprised to see how low their adoption was, like 40%, at least in 2025. I think some of that's changing as people are starting to try some of these tools and get them integrated into their existing flow, and see how really good it is, especially if you've got a massive code base, 10 million lines of code. You throw one of these guys at it, and it is phenomenal what it can do. Its immediate understanding and intuition is just really profound. Next is Google. This is not too shocking. They came out with a 3 model for Gemini, and it's really good. I mean, it's really good. If you look at the trend line for them, it really is exponential in the last 6 months. Like it was slow, and then they're like, okay, we got to really like get serious about this. And Gemini 3 is really solid. I think it seems to be very expressive and seems to have a really good general understanding, and definitely seems to be good at programming problems in a way that I feel like OpenAI stuff isn't, but that's just my kind of anecdotal experience. And it's pretty low adoption in 2025, pretty low adoption. I think most people, at least for software engineers, thought of it as, a bit of a, kind of interesting, but really just them trying to stay relevant in AI, but wasn't necessarily, frontier in the way that Anthropic or OpenAI was. But I think a lot of that's changed. 2.5 was really, really solid. I used that one a lot and was very impressed. And 3, it's just been like, okay, now you're really like one of the big boys and really stood out. So I've really been impressed with it. And it's within striking range from a software engineer bench level. Also, I would say kind of anecdotally, not anecdotally, but like as a tangent, I also think Google is the probably the biggest player of these 4 that actually has the most fundamental business prowess that can actually win sustainably long term of the 4 of these, because their business model is just so rock solid, and they already have so much wide adoption of their core products. Integrating AI is just super intuitive because all their products are effectively digital. So integrating Gemini into basically everything that Google owns is like a no-brainer, and they're making money off of it. And so to me, that's a really strong. That would be hard to bet against Google, hard to bet against them, and especially for something like Atlas to compete against something like Chrome, which is every day you do an update on Chrome, you just see radical upgrades to that experience, into where it's becoming more and more of an intuitive next evolution of Chrome that I think would be really hard to bet against. So anyway, I think Google's really a really good job there, and really, really keep an eye on their models. And if you're not using it as part of at least part of your workflow, try it out. Next is XAI. So obviously this is very recent, like the last year or so. I want to say 13, 14 months ago they were just kind of created. And they're sort of own a bunch of different things related to X. And specifically, they kind of run this Grok model, which is really good. I mean, I think it's easy to kind of just like lose track of it because all the stuff that happens with X and all the different things kind of around all the different properties. But I will say the actual model itself is really, really solid. There's not any like software engineer benchmarks against it, and that's not something that they've kind of opted into. So there's been some sort of estimates and some independent tests kind of putting around the mid 70s. But I will say that the fact that it's just sort of like keeps showing up and kind of consistently just kind of keep putting a dent in these things makes me think that it will be a long-term sustainable player, and it has a long-term business model in that it is built into X. And so it's going to get a ton of users right there, and you're going to get a lot of exposure. In the same way that Meta AI, like that's not something you want to lose track of because they have so much finance. The finances are really solid, and they have a way of disseminating and getting users of the model, which will help train the model. I think it's not something you want to lose track of. But I think their actual primary value is actually in their data centers. I think that's their unfair advantage, in that they're really focused on building that. And I kind of mentioned their Colossus expansion. That's sort of building that out. That's huge. Getting that extra data center. Also, they have had a lot of challenges with content moderation because it is built into X. You get the highs and the lows of that. You get a lot of eyes into it. And if it's, I think famously, under moderated in that it's definitely more of an like open AI, but it is an AI that is kind of chosen to have less moderation and less restrictions. As a feature, obviously, it's going to be some challenges in the future. What I'm interested to see is from a pure software engineer, I'm writing code. What impact will that have at the very tip of the spear of what is the potential of AI? Will having moderation or not having moderation impact its effectiveness? To be determined. But I think we'll know, and I think in 2026 we'll have a good answer to that as we start to reach some pinnacle, maybe peak of potential. We'll see. So let's go ahead and look at some of the tooling. So these are the players and some of the models. But tooling is very interesting as well, because this is how most people actually interact with the models. They're not just hitting the API. They're using a tool to do it. And so a couple of big interesting takeaways here, you could probably talk about this for an hour, but is all the little players. I've heard of a few of these. I've used a few of these, but there's a lot of little guys biting at the feet of the big players. A lot of these are just focused on super duper consumer friendly focused experiences, and they might use whatever model under the hood. Sometimes they expose that. Sometimes it's just magic and they just do that. But if you actually say, hey, what tooling are you actually using to actually build these experiences out? One of the things that sort of is not, at least in this survey, but you might say, hey, does this count? Is something like a Cursor? It's tricky because it's like, Cursor isn't necessarily a first-party tooling in the way that maybe Claude Code is, and that it is built around a single model, but is something I'd really kind of like to get in the next, I'll do this next week, is to kind of compare pure IDEs to IDEs, because there's a lot of IDE-specific kind of implementations, and this is kind of thinking more broadly. And if you just were to filter by, these wide consumer, just go and build it things, these are the big ones that came up, but I would really interested to see explicitly IDEs and compare them. But if you were to look at least this particular breakdown, you really see a couple of clear winners here. So one is Microsoft and OpenAI. So Microsoft obviously has got the sort of the Copilot and the Copilots, right? So there's like the auto completion variant, and then there's also just, hey, the chat version. So chat integrated into VS Code. And both of those I think are not entirely ubiquitous, but VS Code is by far the most popular IDE. And because of that, having the integration in there, having the tight coupling with Microsoft and OpenAI to present their like really great models, some of them totally for free, it's a really compelling experience. And so something we'll definitely have to play around with and see how that goes forward, because they're definitely, there's a lot of competition out there. Claude Code, obviously extremely popular, as well as a lot of these other ones. Perplexity is still keeps showing up. And so, yeah, a lot of interesting conversations to be had here, but OpenAI is also winning too, because if you think of, when we talk about Microsoft, that their model is OpenAI. So anything Microsoft is, OpenAI winning under the hood. So, and all these other ones might, depending on which one we're talking about here, might call OpenAI as well. So even if, 20% of these call OpenAI, like the pie is looking very OpenAI-ish, just the whole thing starts to feel very, very heavily in there. But that shouldn't be too big of a surprise if you think of OpenAI's tendency to try and build consumer-focused products first and foremost, and really try and make it easy to use those. I think they've accomplished that by being so widely used by these other providers. A lot to be said here, but we'll talk more about this next week. So the next topic is the market. So what's the state of hiring and firing? And so this is something that obviously we're really familiar with at Hacker Relay. So we got a lot of really great intel here. So demand is something we could talk about all day, but it's really not too different. It kind of depends on what your experience has been. But this isn't too shocking. Juniors are shrinking. That's probably not too big of a surprise. But staff is still small, and it's pretty much then evenly split between mid and senior. And so what that to me means is sort of what we've kind of all known, which is people would rather hire a mid-level or senior engineer. They'd kind of prefer that because they want someone that they can just kind of hand over an abstract problem and they just sort of work on. And they don't necessarily want to spoon feed a junior, especially now given that agents are basically kind of the same thing. You give them a clearly articulated task and they go achieve it. I would rather just hire an agent for $100 a month and have it work for me versus hiring a junior engineer for $100,000 a year. So I think that's a pretty fair thing to say. I would say by the end of 2026, the junior one might be even half, with the mid-level and senior expanding. And I might even make the case that mid-level will continue to shrink through 2026 because, again, people would rather have one person on the team than 5 people on the team. If that one person can get just as much as that 5, I'd rather just pay that person double and everyone wins. Especially if you give them really best-of-class tooling, they're really good at using the models and workflows. I think that'll continue to change. So, as always, my advice has been and will continue to be: don't sell yourself as a junior. Sell yourself as something else, anything, but don't say junior. Don't say, "Hey, I'm just trying to get my foot in the foot in the water. I'm just trying to try this out, get some experience," because there's just too much demand for or too little demand for too much supply for juniors. Next is sort of where people are working. So this doesn't look too shocking until you think about it or you look at it as compared to maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So it looks like, hey, 50% remote, and then there's some hybrid. So like, hey, I can work from home. Like things are looking like I can work from home. But if we were to compare this to maybe 3 or 4 years ago, it was 90% remote and hybrid. And so to consistently see remote roles turn into hybrid roles or hybrid roles turn into completely in-office roles is really surprising, because I would have said mid-COVID, hey, this is the new norm. And in some ways it is, but for a lot of companies, with the amount of hiring, with the hiring being so small and so few engineers being added to teams, they can ask more of them. And that includes, we want you in office. And so, especially with the growth and where a lot of engineers are being hired are at FANG type companies or startups, those kind of companies have historically leaned into coming to the office. It's either really nice, so we've got really great perks, or we're a startup and we all sleep in the same room. And it's like a little, monastery here where we just live and breathe this thing. And so to me, it doesn't seem totally crazy, especially here in the Bay Area. But we'll see. We'll see how this goes and grows. But if this trend line were to continue, I would say that remote might be down to 2/3 what it currently is by the end of the year. If the trend line were to continue, we'll see. Lastly, is just sort of this kind of snapshot from our data set from Hacker Relay, where we sort of take a snapshot each week of how many jobs were posted and sort of you get a good sense of, highs and lows and those kind of things. I'll move myself so I'm out of the way here. But basically, you're like, what do I make of this? But you can just say, oh, it was the holidays. So you can kind of see sort of Thanksgiving there, and then things are kind of flattening at the end of the year, which is pretty typical. But if you actually were to look at the last 4 weeks of 2025 and compare them to the previous 4, it was down 60%. So that's just obviously a lot. Like even week 47 was higher than 49, 50, and 52 combined. Just dead at the end of the year. So let's say it's the end of the year, but in practice, it is aligned with the overall trend that just hiring is just slowed across the board. Hiring is slowed, and people have gotten pickier with the people that they do hire. I would say they expect twice as much, but they're willing to pay you 50% more. So yeah, you might make more, but a lot's going to be more expected of you. Let's move on to sort of the last section here. So the last kind of topic is what I call the meta. So sort of the game of the game. How is an engineer supposed to stand out in this crazy world where so much is expected of them, whether you're trying to get your first job or you're a tech lead trying to stay relevant, or maybe find that really great startup job? How do you stay relevant when there's so many incredible models out there that are doing what you do for a hundredth or thousandth or 100,000th the price, whatever it is, super duper cheap, and really, really powerful? How do you stay relevant? So let's talk a little bit about that. And there's really kind of four key strategies that seem to keep showing up in the sort of the studies and my conversations with tech leads, as well as just sort of all the data that we were able to track. So first one is AI native workflows. Now, this might be, self-evident, but you really need to think of this not like AI assisted, but what does a complete end-to-end AI experience look like? What does that really look like? From concept all the way through the end, how can I make sure that AI is collaborating and contributing as much as possible? That might be self-evident to you, but if there's any part of your flow that you're like, I step in here, maybe reevaluate that and see why. So a couple of things to be kind of thinking there. Again, I already mentioned truly end-to-end, but there I think Figma to AWS stands. So am I using MCPs to pull in Figma design? And is my infra, is it in code? How can I make it to where the models are able to chat with these things? And if I don't have an MCP server for something and I have to copy and paste in pictures for it to know what I'm talking about, then chances are, it is used as an aid and not used as a replacement. And either you replace yourself or your boss replaces you might be the kind of headspace to be at, even if that seems a little extreme. Also, if you do have a code base that your AI is working on, do you just have one model? Do you have two models? Do you have three models? And I'm not talking, in sequence, like pick between models. I'm talking at the same time. You've got front end part of your code, a back end part of your code. At minimum, that could be two models working simultaneously, at minimum. And so those are things to be thinking about if you're trying to stay relevant, because we're not just tracking quality of code, but quantity of code. And if you can produce 100 features versus 10 features, you're 10 times more valuable. And that puts you in a position to hopefully earn a little bit more. So that's something to be thinking, that level of, abdicating of your current control. Next one is measurable brightness, which is kind of maybe not the best turn of phrase there, but if you're going to be handing things over to models, you need to be obsessive about tracking those. And just like a really good manager keeps checking in on its team, how well are you tracking how well the models are doing? It's pretty common just to say, hey, it feels like this one's working. Let me switch to a different model if it feels like it's not working. Like, hey, it's been working on this for like 20, 30 minutes and it still hasn't figured it out. Let me switch to a different model. Well, that's a good start. Being able to articulate why you chose a model and understand what makes that model good at something, or at least be able to categorize it as a specialist in some type of thing that you can reproduce in the future if you're having success. Or if it's not good, be able to know that it's not good under some circumstances so you can reevaluate it if that model gets updated later. Because models are always changing, and just because ChatGPT was really bad in 5.1 on something doesn't mean it's still bad. So you know what to evaluate. And we talked about understanding your team, just like anyone in leadership role. Your team is now agents. So how can you effectively manage a team of 10 or 100 agents? How do you think about that? How do you give them a scorecard and not just say, hey, I just felt like it didn't do a good job today? You need to have an understanding of how to manage them and actually give them performance reviews. And if they're not doing a good job, fire them for at least for the time being. And analytics and metrics, like if it does produce a feature, hey, how well is that feature working? And hold it to a high standard. Like, why not? Like, it's not going to hurt its feelings. If it's failing at its job, maybe put it down for a little bit and pick it up later. And be obsessive. And there's no reason why you can't pick these really strict goals for something like test coverage. Why not? Why not pick 100% test coverage as a goal? Like, why not? At least have some standard. And then you can prove that when you gave control over to the AI, you did it with some open-eyed clarity and were making a decision using your own judgment and not just because it was easy. So this is, again, we're talking about, hey, I want to stay relevant. I want to make more money. Well, you get paid to do things that other people or AIs can't currently do. And so part of that's orchestrating, part of that's stitching together multiple tools, but also part of this is working on things that it's just currently not being trusted with, or as trusted as somebody wants a human. So we talk about man in the middle systems. Well, what systems are really like still truly man in the middle? Like adding a button no one cares. Hand it over to AI like it's just a button. Who cares? We've gotten to the point now where it's just assumed it can handle most front end stuff. But what are things we still feel scared about? Money, infra, kind of policy related things. That's where you can still have relevance and still provide unique insight as not just an engineer, but effectively a product manager now. For better or worse, that's your job now, is to manage these things and engage with stakeholders and have a really clear understanding of the business objectives, and then being able to articulate and enforce those rules on the code base. And so because of that, that's an opportunity for you to stay relevant, stay meaningful, and be a really effective dealer and all things related to these systems. So kind of, like I said, this beyond just like, hey, go chew on this, Godspeed. Instead, be able to follow up, understand what the expectations are, and whether it's through a prompt that has the policy that you're able to keep feeding it and say, hey, again, as a reminder, here's the policy, just to be clear, or whether it's having like a lot of these, a lot of AI support, like an agents file or something like that, where you're able to, it's fed along in every single request, having some way of maintaining consistent, reliable set of policies that you're able to enforce is going to be more powerful, more and more powerful. Because if you don't, you just look like an amateur abuser of AI and not an effective user of it. And also pricing is going to matter. Like, again, if you think about 100 agents working on your code base, and especially if you start handing things off to remote servers or doing sub agents, where you could have, it's not unfathomable to think of 100 agents working on your code base. Maybe it is to you, but it won't be by the end of the year. So if you had 100 agents, how do you have a understanding of what the cost implications of those are? And if you do just feel like, hey, I sometimes give it stuff to do, how can you keep it on task and working on really meaningful stuff consistently? And where do I spend the money in the right places? Models have different cost structures, and certain models are worth spending extra money on. And sometimes others are just expensive because they're new, but they're not really solving the right type of problem. And that's why it's really good to know what certain team members are really good at. And if one costs 5 times as much, but is doing 100 times more work, that could be worth it. And not just the cheapest isn't always the worst. But at the same time, for some of these things, if you're going and you're updating a TypeScript type across the entire repo, sometimes that extra value and context is lost on it. And you don't need to think about that. Just execute it as quickly as possible and as few tokens as possible. So having an understanding of that is incredibly valuable and seemingly rare, as things have gotten so cheap and easy that people lose track of that. But you don't want to find yourself caught like with an AWS bill. No one wants an AWS bill of $100,000. Well, you also don't want like a model, coming back and saying, hey, that's $300 or $500 when you budgeted $20 or something. So something to keep in mind as we scale. Kind of last kind of topic here is try your best to forgive and forget. So much changes so quick. And I found myself saying, hey, ChatGPT is just not good at this thing. And I just block it out of my brain. And I'll come back 6 months later and I'm kicking myself because it's long been fixed. It's long been improved. And I sat there and have abdicated my responsibility to be up to date on these things and have assumed it's still bad at that thing. And I'm like, yeah, it's 5 times cheaper, but like, it's like terrible. But actually it's what if it's better? What if it's gotten a lot better? And if you think about the quantity of models, even like, let's just say even within OpenAI, there's 14 to 25 different models depending on how many generations you're talking about and what modals you're talking about. But within that, you think how many of these are amazingly perfectly tuned with a context perspective, from a cost perspective, if I just were to plug it into the right place. And so always be reevaluating where you think is the latest and greatest, because as soon as one little thing changes, everything changes. A good last example is the model may not have changed, but if the IDE that you're using changes, sometimes the models are now radically better, radically worse. So you need to always be reevaluating. And if you've had a bad experience, jot it down and come back in a week or two. Not a month or two, not a year or two, like a week or two, because so much changes so quickly. If you're not actively retrying things, you might find yourself benching your star player just because he had a bad day. So make sure you're reevaluating consistently what your best team looks like at any given point. So kind of reevaluating that stuff there. But yeah, like the prompting meta is always changing. Whatever the wrapper is for the model is rapidly changing. I think recently it was like leaked some of the cursor prompting that they have baked into things. Super interesting. And also, like all these different tools have all these prompting wrapped around the core models. And so you might say, hey, this model's terrible, but there's so many contributing factors that are unknown to you that don't just assume something's broken just because it didn't work for you that day. So that's it for us. Hopefully this was interesting, useful. Love talking about this. I'm going to be doing this every week. And if you find this information interesting, or you want sort of a dedicated one of these just for you, we have all this completely built out at hackerrelay.com. It's invite only, but go ahead and request access and we'll see what we can do. Hopefully this has been interesting and useful, and we will talk next week.